Okay, everybody. So the other side of the bounds relate to horizontal integration. Hope you like my image here, as it is not horizontal, but diagonal, and there is no diagonal bounds. But nonetheless, let's move forward thinking about why a company would engage in horizontal integration. Now, what you want to think here in comparison to vertical integration, where the firm might be buying up the supply chain, is that firms are now engaging in multiple markets. So, hence, horizontal. They're making horizontal moves. They're leaving their direct market or at the same time working in that market, but as well as another. Why would a company want to do this? In a lot of ways, it's quite similar to vertical integration. They are seeking some form of economies of scale or scope. So, by engaging in multiple markets, firms might be able to produce cost advantages. Another large reason might be related to the five forces. If I am in multiple markets, I may be creating barriers to entry to rival firms who would want to compete with my company in individual markets. So it allows me access to greater capital. It allows me the potential to have lower prices in one market if I can make them up in another. So another big reason is trying to get some sense of diversification. And this is what we're seeing in a lot of the larger firms that exist in the economy today. Basically, this is the world of conglomeration. Now, what's the sense of economies of scope? Okay, well, the company has to ask if it's cheaper for me to produce in two different markets than to specialize, then I should do it. So what I'm trying to look for is the economic benefit of producing more than one good or more than for more than one market pay off. If so, then there might be justification to do so. Now, there could be other reasons also, and again, they would relate to the five forces, creating some type of barrier to entry, creating possibly supplier power if that was the way that the company horizontally integrated. And they could also then be able to kind of have more influence over their buyers, basically guiding them in the direction of the prices that the company would like to receive. Okay, where might we see economies of scale and scope in terms of horizontal integration? One main place is that firms are able to then spread out fixed costs even further. If you need a little Econ 101 here, fixed costs are the costs that a company will incur regardless of any production. So if the company has zero things going on, there still will be costs associated with just existing. Now, it is then a very important idea that companies try to spread those out as much as possible per unit of production. This will then lower overall total cost. So they're trying to lower these costs by increasing productivity. Uh, how they might be able to do this is employing the use of these machinery or whatever they're doing to produce a good and service over multiple uses. So, think about, say, like a flour mill. They could readjust pretty quickly to produce lots of different types of flour. And they're going to use the same equipment and they're going to use generally the same process. But if they gear it up a little tighter, maybe they'll make a finer flour. If they make it a little looser, then maybe they'll get that rough grain flour. So these are just different ways that a company could utilize the same equipment, spreading out the fixed costs of ownership across multiple product lines, hence horizontal integration. Now, there's some other ways that firms could try to spread out their fixed costs. Generally, the idea is related to mass production. So they could have multiple plants with different types of equipment, but producing lots of different products overall. Just like I mentioned previously, it could be related to making tiny changes in the equipment and then able to produce greater amounts of products. Another example here might be, say, like a milk manufacturer like Chateau. They can easily take the same equipment that they utilize to make milk and adjust it to make other milk products. Or a favorite of mine, the brewery. It doesn't take much to use the same equipment to make hundreds of different styles of beer. And potentially, while you may think beer would be in one single market, all those different types of beers allow for the company to be able to diversify the buyers. So think about Boulevard. They produce barrel-aged beers for one market. They produce kind of low-calorie beers for another. They produce traditional style beers for another group of people. While all people may buy all these different products, the idea is that they have different product lines for different markets. But again, utilized all the same equipment, all the same technology to produce those products. Hence, they are spreading out the fixed costs of production. Now, other ways that companies try to spread fixed costs out and also engage in horizontal integration is ways you may not have thought about. When a company has to engage in a ton of research and development, or have to buy specific equipment, or may have to train large amounts of labor, or have different setup costs associated with production, how are they going to be able to make those things work for them? So, where might we see research and development? We could also think about in terms of advertising. I'll come back to research and development in just a few minutes. In advertising, you think of these national ad campaigns, right? So the goal here is to have one message and spread it out across the entire nation. Think about a Super Bowl Sunday commercial. They are insanely expensive, but they know that they can reach such a large audience. One time spot, one time message, but across let's say millions of people who might be watching that game at any given time. And this then can lower the cost per message. Well, back to kind of this idea of the conglomerate. Okay, so here we have Unilever. This is one of the most horizontally integrated firms I could think of. They produce everything from shampoo to ice cream. They're a chemical company. They know how to make different organizations of compounds into lots and lots of different things to sell. There's toothpaste. There is, let's see, tea. They have peanut butter. Towards the other side, they have makeup and Q-tips. I mean, all this stuff kind of stems from very, very similar production processes. And what they're going to try to do is leverage that technology and leverage that machinery to make as many different products as possible. Okay, so what I'm asking you is to think about, where do you see economies of scale in your firms? Thinking about the hotel industry, you're going to see a ton of economies of scale. They're trying to get the most out of those massive, massive buildings that they own, and trying to get every way possible for their consumers to buy and utilize those buildings. So how can I keep them there as long as possible? You could see in fast food industry where they're trying to leverage national messages, franchise messages. They also employ mass production of all the inputs before they're cooked in many cases. So they have economies of scale in terms of the supply chain. So what I want you to do is think about your strategic group, and do you see economies of scale? And this would be really the basis for your argument of how these companies have horizontally integrated. The questions that you want to consider, though, are what types of economies of scale? Have the economies of scale acted as a barrier to entry to potential rivals? And how did they get to be this way? Was it through market pressures, or do you believe that it was through strategic design? All right, now there are other ways you might even see it. Okay, so there is a large organization known as a Chabal. And all this really is a group of firms that kind of coexist and support each other. So in the case of Samsung, they exist in that type of organization, a Chabal, in South Korea. Now, what they're going to do is basically make everything that goes into everything. In fact, GDP in South Korea, around 40%, is driven by exports, and much of that has to do with this large organization known as Samsung. So what Samsung does is try to put their name on every single thing possible. Let's kind of get a few examples here. All right, so what's going on here? How do I see horizontal integration in these products? Well, if you notice, yes, I have a phone and I have a and I have a tablet, and there is a camera, obviously. And what's the common denominator here? Well, the software and the technology inside all of these is basically the same investment. So Samsung very quickly realized, if I could nail down, if I could specialize in this one piece, how do I put this into every possible thing? In which case they have things like this. And all of these then have all that same similar type of technology. You may have seen the fridge that has a TV on the front of it so that you can see inside your fridge without having to open the door. Uh, Bizarre idea, but nonetheless, right, utilizing the same technology and spreading it across different markets. Notice they'll all say Samsung. You come from these, and this is where we originally developed our perception of Samsung. And now, if we see Samsung, uh, after we got over the fact that washing machines exploded, then we come back to our value proposition that Samsung products are high quality. Now, you could see that this actually backfires, and I do think it's important always to think about ways that this stuff fails. Okay, so when you do see too much of brand spreading, that does potentially lead to a reduction in the value proposition. So you may ask yourself, does knowing that Lexus is owned by Toyota decrease the value proposition that a Lexus is a high quality car? It depends upon the consumer, but you can be sure that the companies who do have a brand portfolio that has higher end products and lower end products does everything possible to try to keep the illusion up that they are different, they are fundamentally different, and there's nothing related in those two product lines. That being said, you can obviously see very, very extreme similarities in these type of cars, in this example, and the technology in both of them is stemming from the same source. So to produce a car is to produce a car, but to put different labels on it and those then act as a source of performance, right? That's where they're able to make the proposition that the Lexus is somehow higher quality. Okay, so kind of moving forward, here's my example of R&D that I didn't get to perfectly in the previous slides, but considering pharmaceutical companies, right? So it is kind of a well-known discussion of why are drug prices the way they are. To manufacture a drug is cents after it has been developed. I mean fractions of a cent to produce these things. But clearly, what goes into the price of pharmaceuticals is all of the research and development. So pharmaceutical companies want to leverage that research as much as possible. Think about drugs that are out there that started for one purpose and then end up being for a fundamentally different purpose. Drugs that inflated our lips are now used to treat migraines. Right? So drug companies are always trying to figure out new ways to leverage all that R&D, and they're very good at creating new illnesses and new ways to treat them. So again, a sense of trying to create economies of scale, and in fact, then also creating their own markets at the same time. So rather than enter to new markets, they create new markets. Now, we could also see some other costs of this whole process. Maybe brand becomes deflated from producing too many things with the same name. But when companies get too large, organization becomes hard to manage. We also see the potential, while less today, for unionization and the increase in labor costs, or utilizing resources in a way that maybe pushes them to extremes. And thinking about how to extract in one location, at some point you're going to start to see, while you may have enjoyed a lower cost initially, you may start to see cost of extraction potentially increasing. A last cost of getting too big is dealing with coordination and lots of different people's sense of what should be the right thing. That's actually very similar to what we saw in the costs of vertical integration. You bring in more management and you bring in different people who believe that they have the right way to do it. Well, those are costs to the organization as a whole. So there is a sense that becoming too big can be too big. And in fact, if you look at the economic landscape today, you see a lot of these conglomerates that have grown to this major size are starting to break up. My go-to example for that is thinking about General Electric. Used to be producing almost everything possible, multiple segments in their entire corporation, and now they're breaking off individual segments so that they can be standalone. Yeah, so unionization is definitely a potential cost, but arguably sometimes I think a necessary cost. Um, that's a tough one. Now, what else do we have? Again, a firm gets too large, we're going to start to see coordination effects. We're going to start to see some issues with now we have to deal with basically more transaction costs from dealing with more people. So why would we ever want to do this? Really, it all comes down to one simple reason. How can I spread out costs of one activity? And if you needed a way to think about horizontal integration a different way, just think of it as diversification. It becomes cheaper to have different eggs in the same basket. And so that's kind of the gist. It's not really a too tough of an idea to get, but what your goal is for this section of the paper is to look at ways that the firms in your strategic group have engaged in multiple markets. I know for a fact that all of them have, and so that's what I'd like you to focus on. Find some ways that these firms have been successful, and then also try to create a sense of whether you believe that you'll see more of this type of activity, and also maybe what was the source? Why would they ever think about engaging in multiple processes rather than specializing in their initial purpose? So one section left to go, and that regards global expansion. So this will be when firms leave their domestic market. They very well could be doing exactly the same thing, or they could be fundamentally reinventing themselves. But I'll see you in the next clip for that discussion.